We spent hours over this one. Every trench, every shell hole, every splintered tree or fragment of farmhouse wall stood out clearly. We could identify machine gun posts and battery positions. We could see at a glance the result of months of fighting, how terribly men had suffered under a rain of high explosive at this point, how lightly they had escaped at another. And so we could follow, with a certain degree of accuracy, what must have been the infantry actions at various parts of the line. The history of these trench campaigns will have a foreboding interest to the student of the future. For as he reads of the battles on the Aisne, the Somme, of Verdun and Flanders, he will have spread out before him photographs of the battlefields themselves, just as they were at different phases of the struggle. With a series of these pictorial records, men will be able to find the trenches from which their fathers or grandfathers scrambled with the regiments to the attack, the wire entanglements which held up the advance at one point, the shell holes where they lay under machine-gun fire, and often they will see the men themselves as they advanced through the barrage fire, the sun glinting on their helmets. It will be a fascinating study in a ghastly way. And while such records exist, the outward meanings, at least, of modern warfare will not be forgotten. Tiffin, the mess-room steward, was standing by my cot with a lighted candle in his hand. The furrows of his kindly old face were outlined in shadow. His bald head gleamed like the bottom of a yellow bowl. He said, "Bon matin, monsieur," put the candle on my table, and went out, closing the door softly. I looked at the window square, which was covered with oiled cloth for want of glass. It was a black patch, showing not a glimmer of light. The other pilots were gathering in the mess room, where a fire was going. Someone started the phonograph. Fritz Kreisler was playing Chansons sans Paroles. This was followed by a song, "Oh, movin' man, don't take my baby grand." It was a strange combination, and to hear them at that hour of the morning, before going out for a first sortie over the lines, gave me a mixed-up feeling, which it is impossible to analyze. Two patrols were to leave the field at the same time, one to cover a sector at an altitude of from 2,000 to 3,000 meters, the other 3,500 to 5,000 meters. J.B. and I were on high patrol, owing to our inexperience. It was to be a purely defensive one between our observation balloons and the lines. We had still many questions to ask, but having been so persistently inquisitive for 3 days running, we thought it best to wait for Talbot, who was leading our patrol, to volunteer his instructions. He went to the door to look at the weather. There were clouds at about 3,000 meters, but the stars were shining through gaps in them. On the horizon, in the direction of the lines, broad belt of blue sky. The wind was blowing into Germany. He came back yawning, "We'll go up, ho hum, tremendous yawn, through a hole before we reach the river. It's going to be clear presently, so the higher we go, the better." The others yawned sympathetically. "I don't feel very pugnastic this morning. It's a crime to send men out at this time of day, night, rather." More yawns of assent, of protest. J.B. and I were the only ones fully awake. We had finished our chocolate and were watching the clock uneasily, afraid that we would be late getting started. 10 minutes before patrol time we went out to the field. The canvas hangars billowed and flapped, and the wooden supports creaked with the quiet sound made by ships at sea. And there was almost peace of the sea there, intensified, if anything, by the distant rumble of heavy cannonading. Our Spad biplanes were drawn up in 2 long rows outside the hangars. They were in exact alignment, wing to wing. Some of them were clean and new, others discolored with smoke and oil. Among those latter were the ones which J.B. and I were to fly. Being new pilots, we were given used machines to begin with, and ours had already seen much service. Fuselage and wings had many patches over the scars of old battles, but new motors had been installed, the bodies overhauled, and they were ready for further adventures. It mattered little to us that they were old. They were to carry us out to our first air battles. They were the first avions which we could call our own, and we loved them in an almost personal way. Each machine had an Indian head, the symbol of the Lafayette Corps, painted on the sides of the fuselage. In addition, it bore the personal mark of its pilot, a triangle, a diamond, a straight band, or an initial, painted large so it could be easily seen and recognized in the air. The mechanicians were getting the motors en route, arming the machine guns, and giving a final polish to the glass of the windshields. In a moment every machine was turning over ralenti, with the purring sound of powerful engines, which gives a voice to one's feeling of excitement just before patrol time. There was no more yawning, no languid movement. Rodman was buttoning himself into a combination suit which appeared to add another 6 inches to his 6 feet 2. Barry, who was leading the low patrol, wore a woolen helmet which left only his eyes uncovered. I had not before noticed how they blazed and snapped. All his energy seemed to be concentrated in them. Porter wore a leather face mask with a lozenge-shaped breathing hole and slanted openings covered with yellow glasses for eyes. He was the most fiendish-looking demon of them all. I was glad to turn from him to the Duke, who wore a passe-montagne of white silk, which fitted him like a bonnet. As he sat in his machine adjusting his goggles, he might have passed for a dear old lady preparing to read a chapter from the book of Daniel. The fur of Dorman's helmet had frayed out, so that it fitted around the sides of his face and under the chin like a beard, the kind worn by old-fashioned sailors. The strain of waiting patiently for the start was trying. The sudden transformation of a group of typical-looking Americans into monsters and devotional old ladies gave a moment of diversion which helped to relieve it. I heard Talbot shouting his parting instructions and remembered that I did not know the rendezvous. I was already strapped in my machine and was about to loosen the fastenings when he came over and climbed on the step of the car. "Rendezvous at 2000 over field," he yelled. I nodded. "Know me, Big T, wings, fuselage. I'll be turning right. You and the others left. When see me, start lines, fall behind, left. Remember, stick close, patrol. If get lost, better home. Compass southwest. Look carefully. Landmarks, going out. Got straight?" I nodded again to show that I understood. Machines of both patrols were rolling across the field, a mechanician running along beside each one. I joined the long line and taxied over to the starting point, where the captain was superintending the send-off, and turned into the wind in my turn. As though conscious of his critical eye, my old veteran Spad lifted its tail and gathered flying speed with all the vigor of its youth, and we were soon high above the hangars, climbing to the rendezvous. When we had all assembled, Talbot headed northeast, the rest of us falling into our places behind him. Then I found, despite the new motor, my machine was not a rapid climber. Talbot noticed this and kept me well in the group, he and the others losing height in reversements and retournements, diving under me and climbing up again. It was fascinating to watch them doing stunts, to observe the constant changing of positions. Sometimes we seemed, all of us, to be hanging motionless, then rising and falling like small boats riding a heavy swell. Another glance would show one of them suspended bottom up, falling sideways, tipped vertically on a wing, standing on its tail as though being blown about by the wind, out of all control. It is only in the air, when moving with them, that one can really appreciate the variety and grace of movement of a flock of high-powered avions de chasse. I was close to Talbot as we reached the cloud bank. I saw him in dim silhouette as the mist, sunlight filtered, closed around us. Emerging into the clear, fine air above it, we might have been looking at early morning from the casement, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fiery lands forlorn. The sun was just rising, and the floor of cloud gathered with delicate shades of rose and amethyst and gold. I saw the others rising through it at widely scattered points. It was a glorious sight. Then, forming up and turning